There is a particular quality to the silence before a battle that no historian has ever quite captured in words. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of 10,000 men breathing in the dark, each one aware, in that animal way that all creatures sense approaching catastrophe, that the morning coming toward them across the horizon may be the last morning they ever see. It is the silence of men sharpening blades they have already sharpened 3 times. The silence of prayers spoken in languages that have never shared a prayer before. The silence of 2 civilizations, each certain of its own divine mandate, each exhausted by the weight of its own ambitions, lying down on opposite sides of a field in what is now the French countryside, waiting for the sun. October, 732 years after the birth of a man whose teachings had since divided the world. The plain near the town of Poitiers, in the region the Romans once called Gaul, was cold that autumn. The harvest had already been pulled from the earth. The trees along the river Vienne had begun to release their leaves in the slow, indifferent way that trees have always marked the dying of a year, without ceremony, without grief, with only the quiet mathematics of season. A crow lifted from a branch somewhere in the gray distance and did not return. On one side of that field lay the army of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, governor of Al-Andalus, commander of the Umayyad forces, pushing north through the territory the Franks called their own. His cavalry were among the finest in the known world. His soldiers carried with them not just weapons, but the momentum of 100 years of near unbroken expansion, an empire that had risen from the Arabian desert and stretched, in a single century, from the edge of India to the mountains that divide Spain from France. They had crossed the Pyrenees. They had pushed through the valleys of what would one day become France. They had sacked one of the wealthiest Christian shrines in the West. They had every reason to believe that what lay before them was simply the next chapter in a story that had only ever moved in one direction. On the other side lay the army of Charles, called the mayor of the palace of the Frankish kingdom, not a king. Technically, though the distinction had grown increasingly difficult to explain. His forces were infantry, mostly heavy, disciplined in the particular way that men become disciplined when they have been fighting their entire lives and have simply run out of fear to waste. They came from tribes that had names the Roman world had once recorded with disdain. Franks, Burgundians, Alemanni, peoples who had been barbarians to one empire and would become the foundation of another. Neither army fully understood what the other represented. Neither army could have understood what historians would one day say about the morning that was coming. History rarely announces itself. It arrives like weather felt before it is seen. This is the story of the Battle of Tours. But it is also the story of everything that made that battle inevitable. The empires that collapsed to create it. The man who fought it and what he was truly fighting for. The 7 days that may or may not have changed the trajectory of an entire civilization, and the strange, revealing way that every age since has looked at that cold October morning and seen, in its reflections, not the past, but itself. Settle in, we are going a long way back. To understand why 2 armies were sleeping in a field in central France in the autumn of 732 CE, you have to go back approximately a century. And to go back a century, you have to first understand what the world looked like before the wave arrived. The Mediterranean world of the early 600 CE was in many important ways a world that had been slowly bleeding out for 2 centuries. The Western Roman Empire had formally dissolved in 476 CE, a date that sounds more decisive in a textbook than it felt to anyone living through it. Empires rarely end on a single day. They thin, they fray at the edges. They become outlines of themselves, while the people inside them continue, with remarkable human stubbornness, to behave as though the structure still holds. What had replaced Rome in the West was a patchwork. The Franks held what had been Gaul. The Visigoths controlled the Iberian Peninsula, the landmass we now call Spain and Portugal. The Ostrogoths had Italy for a time. Before the Eastern Roman Emperor, Justinian spent several catastrophic decades trying to reclaim it, and succeeded only in leaving Italy depopulated and exhausted. Britain had fractured into a collection of small kingdoms, whose names, Mercia, Northumbria, Wessex, would eventually become legendary. But in 600 CE were simply tired little polities, trying to survive the cold and the raids. In the east, two empires remained, and they were destroying each other. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome, centered on the great city of Constantinople, and the Sassanid Persian Empire, the heir to an even older tradition of Persian civilization, had been fighting each other for centuries. But the war that began in 600 to CE was different. It was not a border skirmish. It was not a limited campaign for a disputed province. It was an existential struggle that consumed both empires at precisely the moment that something extraordinary was about to emerge from the Arabian Peninsula. The Byzantine-Sassanid War of 600 to 2628 CE is one of the least discussed catastrophes in world history, and one of the most consequential. The Persian king, Khosrow II, seizing on a period of Byzantine political instability, launched a campaign that swept through Syria, captured Jerusalem, carried off the True Cross as a trophy, overran Egypt, Rome's ancient breadbasket, and reached the very walls of Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius responded with one of the most remarkable military campaigns in late antiquity, pushing deep into Persia, threatening the Persian heartland, and eventually forcing a peace settlement. Khosrow was overthrown and murdered by his own son. The Persian Empire, which had been one of the great organizing structures of the ancient world for over a millennium, staggered. Both empires had spent everything. Their treasuries were depleted. Their armies were hollowed out. Their tax-exhausted populations, who had spent decades watching their sons conscripted and their grain requisitioned and their cities burned and rebuilt and burned again, had developed toward their imperial masters a feeling that was not quite loyalty and not quite hatred, but something far more dangerous: indifference. The ground was already soft before the wave arrived. In 610 CE, a merchant and trader in the Arabian city of Mecca, named Muhammad, received, according to the tradition that would grow from this moment, the first of a series of divine revelations. By 622 CE, he and his followers had been forced to flee Mecca for the city of Medina, a migration called the Hijra that would become the beginning of the Islamic calendar. By 630 CE, Muhammad had returned to Mecca in triumph. By 632 CE, he was dead. What happened next is one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of human organization. Within 2 years of Muhammad's death, Arab armies under the Caliphate, the succession of political religious leadership, had begun to push outward from the Arabian Peninsula. Within a decade, they had conquered the Sassanid Persian heartland. Within 20 years, the entire Persian Empire had ceased to exist, an empire that had endured in various forms for 1,000 years, simply gone, absorbed into the expanding world of the early Islamic Caliphate. The last Sassanid emperor, Yazdegerd III, was murdered by a miller in 651 CE, fleeing his own former subjects. The Byzantine Empire survived, barely, and diminished. Egypt was lost by 642 CE. Syria, the breadbasket of the eastern Mediterranean, was gone. North Africa followed. The Byzantines retreated behind their walls and their extraordinary chain of defenses and held on, but the world they had known was unrecognizable. The standard telling of this history frames the Islamic expansion as an almost inexplicable military and religious phenomenon. A desert faith, fierce and fervent, exploding from the margins of the known world and swallowing civilizations that had stood for centuries. This framing is not entirely wrong, but it is importantly incomplete. The historian Hugh Kennedy, in his landmark study of the Arab conquests, makes a point that deserves to be held carefully. The populations of Syria, Egypt, and Persia did not, as a general rule, fight to the last man to defend their existing rulers. They had reasons not to. The Byzantine government in Syria and Egypt had spent decades enforcing a particular form of Christian orthodoxy, the Chalcedonian formula, established at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE, against populations that held different theological views and resented the enforcement deeply. Coptic Christians in Egypt, Aramaic-speaking Christians in Syria, these communities had been taxed, coerced, and theologically harassed by Constantinople for generations. When the Arab armies arrived, the new administration, at least initially, was lighter. Different faiths paid a tax, the jizya, but were generally left to practice as they would. The historian Fred Donner has argued similarly that the early Islamic expansion was not primarily experienced by conquered populations as a religiously motivated invasion in the way that later medieval European observers would understand it. It was experienced as a change of administration, one that, for many communities, was preferable to the previous arrangement. This does not diminish the military achievement of the early Caliphate. The Arab armies were extraordinary fighting forces. They were highly mobile, deeply motivated, and operating with a coherence of purpose that came from the fresh energy of a new and powerful idea about God and community and the right ordering of the world. But they were also arriving into a vacuum that two exhausted empires had spent 30 years creating. The Islamic expansion succeeded, not primarily because it was unstoppable, but because the world it arrived into had already stopped itself. By the time the Umayyad dynasty consolidated power in 661 CE, the first great dynastic caliphate, centered in Damascus, the empire they governed stretched from the borders of China to the edges of North Africa. It was the largest political entity in the world, and it was still moving. North Africa fell in stages through the late 600 CE. The Berber peoples of the Maghreb, the great coastal swath of northwestern Africa that we now call Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, resisted fiercely. A Berber queen known as Kahina led a prolonged resistance. But by 698 CE, Carthage, the ancient rival of Rome, had fallen to the Umayyad forces, and the Maghreb was, at least nominally, under Caliphate control. The Straits of Gibraltar, 14 miles of water between the African continent and the Iberian Peninsula, were crossed in 711 CE. The general Tariq ibn Ziyad landed on the great rock that would take his name, Jabal al-Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, which European tongues would flatten into Gibraltar. He commanded perhaps 7,000 men, mostly Berber, converts to Islam. He was followed by a larger force under the governor Musa ibn Nusayr. The Visigothic kingdom of Iberia, which lay before them, was, by 711 CE, in a state of internal collapse that would have been familiar to anyone who had studied the late Roman West. The king, Roderick or Rodrigo, had come to power only the year before, amid disputed succession and the opposition of rival Visigothic factions. Some of those factions had actually invited the Muslim forces across the water, hoping to use them as pawns in an internal power struggle. This is the kind of historical detail that gets lost in the grand narrative of civilizational clash, the inconvenient fact that the people defending a civilization are often far too busy fighting each other to mount an effective defense against anyone else. The Visigoths were shattered at the Battle of Guadalete in July of 711 CE. Roderick died in the fighting or disappeared. The sources disagree. Within 7 years, the Muslim forces had swept across most of the Iberian Peninsula. Toledo, the Visigothic capital, fell. The Visigoths retreated to small mountain kingdoms in the north, the seeds of what would, 8 centuries later, become the kingdoms of Portugal, Castile, and Aragon. But in 711 CE, the future Reconquista was just a rumor of survival in cold mountain passes. The Iberian Peninsula, Al-Andalus, as the Arab geographers named it, had become part of the Umayyad world, and the Umayyad world was still moving north. The Pyrenees, the mountain spine that divides the Iberian Peninsula from the rest of Europe, had never been an impermeable barrier. Roman armies had crossed them. Visigothic peoples had crossed them. And now, through the passes that the Romans had used, Umayyad forces began to push into the territory the Franks called their own. These were not, at first, full-scale invasions with the intention of permanent colonization. They were raids, extraordinarily well-organized, long-range raids of the kind that had characterized the early expansion. The Umayyad cavalry raided deep into southern Gaul. The city of Narbonne fell in 719 CE and was held. Toulouse was besieged in 721 CE, but held by the Frankish Duke Odo of Aquitaine, who inflicted a notable defeat on the Muslim forces, a battle that has been largely forgotten in the shadow of what came 11 years later. By 732 CE, the raids had grown larger and more ambitious. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Al-Andalus, crossed the Pyrenees with a large force. He defeated Odo of Aquitaine in battle near the Garonne River, a defeat so complete that Odo fled north to seek help from the man he had spent years fighting, the man called Charles, the mayor of the palace of the Frankish kingdom. And here we need to pause on the geography of this moment, because the force that Abd al-Rahman was leading north had already, in the course of this campaign, sacked the Basilica of Saint Martin of Tours, one of the most important and wealthiest religious pilgrimage sites in the entirety of the Western Christian world. This was not a casual raid. This was a penetration of several hundred miles into the European interior, carried out by a force that had crossed an entire mountain range and destroyed some of the most significant economic infrastructure of Frankish Christianity. The Umayyad Caliphate in 732 CE was, from the outside, an overwhelming force. It controlled an empire larger than Rome at its greatest extent. Its armies had not been defeated in any engagement that had altered the fundamental direction of its expansion. Its administrative culture, inherited from Persia and Byzantium and refined by a century of governance, was among the most sophisticated in the world. Its cities, Damascus, Baghdad, would come later. Cordoba was already growing, were centers of learning and commerce that made most of contemporary Europe look, by comparison, like a collection of muddy villages. And yet, under the surface of that overwhelming power, There were fractures forming that the year 732 would not yet reveal, but that the decade following would make brutally apparent. The Umayyad Caliphate was an empire built on the conversion and incorporation of diverse peoples: Arabs, Persians, Berbers, Copts, Syrians, and the question of how those peoples fit into the hierarchy of the new Islamic world had not been resolved cleanly. The Berbers of North Africa, who had converted to Islam in large numbers and fought in its armies, were discovering that conversion did not buy them equal status with Arab Muslims. The resentment was building. The Berber revolt of 742–743 CE, less than a decade after, Tours would erupt with such force that it nearly destroyed Umayyad power in North Africa entirely, and significantly reduced the capacity and appetite for further expansion into Western Europe. But in October of 732, that revolt had not yet begun. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi did not know that the empire that had sent him north was already, in ways he could not see, beginning to turn inward. History is full of armies that were already, without knowing it, on their way home. The force that arrived on that cold October plain was still, by any reasonable measure, one of the most formidable military organizations in the world. It had momentum, it had purpose, it had the psychological weight of a century of victory behind it. And on the other side of the field, it was about to meet a man who had spent his entire life learning how to hold things together when everything around him was coming apart. What happened between those two armies, and what it meant, and what it didn't mean, and what we have made of it in the 12 centuries since, is a story that is far stranger and far more human than the legend has let on. There is something almost geological about the way great civilizations end. They do not simply stop, they subside. Layer by layer, the weight of their own accumulated failures, administrative, military, economic, spiritual, presses down on the structures that once seemed immovable. And those structures begin almost imperceptibly at first, and then, with gathering speed, to sink. The Roman world had been subsiding for 2 centuries before the Arab armies arrived at its eastern edges. The Western Empire's formal dissolution in 476 CE was less an ending than an acknowledgement, a ceremony marking a change that had already occurred. The way a death certificate formalizes the departure of something that left long before the paperwork was filed. In the East, in Byzantium, the Roman tradition held on with extraordinary tenacity, but it held on diminished, contracted, perpetually under pressure from the peoples pressing against its borders. To live in the Mediterranean world of the late 6th century was to live in a world that was always aware of what it was losing. The great cities of the classical world, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, were shadows of what they had been. The trade routes that had once made the Mediterranean a Roman lake had been disrupted by conflict and piracy and the general insecurity of a world whose organizing principle, the Pax Romana, had dissolved. The philosophical schools, the libraries, the institutions of classical learning, these survived, here and there, in reduced and scattered form, maintained by the devotion of individuals whose careers would look to a modern observer like an act of cultural rescue under siege conditions. The plague did its work as well. The plague of Justinian, which struck in 541 CE and returned in waves over the following 2 centuries, killed somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in the Mediterranean world, a catastrophic demographic contraction that reduced the tax base of every empire, depopulated cities, disrupted agricultural production, and left in its wake a landscape of half-empty towns and unworked fields. Both Byzantium and Persia fought their Great War of 600 to 628 CE, with populations that had already been significantly reduced by epidemic disease. They were fighting with the reserves of civilizations that were already running low. It is into this world, depleted, fractured, exhausted, haunted by the memory of a classical order that had not quite managed to fully die, that the Islamic expansion arrived. And it arrived not just as a military force, but as an idea. The idea that there was a God who was one and undivided, who had spoken directly and finally through a prophet whose revelations had been set down in a text that was simultaneously scripture and law and political constitution, who demanded of his followers a particular kind of community, the Ummah, the community of believers, that was, at least in its early idealized form, something new in the world. A community defined not by tribe or ethnicity or language, but by shared belief and shared commitment to a specific understanding of the divine will. This idea had an extraordinary energy in its early decades. People who encountered it, sometimes by conquest, sometimes by conversion, sometimes by the slow social logic of living next to a community that seemed more coherent and purposeful than their own, found in it an organizing principle that the exhausted imperial worlds around them could no longer supply. The Islamic community was young. It was confident. It had texts and institutions and a sense of divine mission that gave its members a clarity of purpose that populations weary from decades of imperial mismanagement must have found genuinely appealing. The military victories followed from this energy as much as the other way around. It is difficult to defeat an army that believes it is doing God's work, not because God actually intervenes in military engagements, but because the psychological resource of certainty is not to be underestimated in the terrible confusion of battle. The Umayyad armies that crossed the Pyrenees in the decades before 732 CE were still carrying this energy. Though the institutional complexities that would eventually fracture the Caliphate were already accumulating beneath the surface. The geography of what they were attempting is worth dwelling on. To move a military force from Al-Andalus into the Frankish interior required crossing the Pyrenees, not an impossible obstacle, but a formidable one, and one that created significant logistical problems. Horses need fodder. Armies need food. Supply lines stretching across a mountain range into territory that was not yet subdued and that contained hostile populations were inherently fragile. The Umayyad forces that pushed into Gaul in the 720s and 730s were operating at the extreme extension of their supply capacity. They could raid, they could burn and loot and move. What they could not easily do was hold the territory they passed through, because holding required garrison forces and administrative infrastructure and the kind of patient, resource-intensive colonial machinery that the Caliphate's attention was primarily directed elsewhere. This logistical reality is crucial to any honest assessment of what Tours actually decided. The question is not whether Abd al-Rahman's army could defeat Charles Martel in a single engagement. The question is whether, had it won that engagement, the Umayyad Caliphate had the political will, the logistical capacity, and the strategic coherence to project permanent power into the Frankish interior against sustained resistance. And the evidence from what happened in the decade following the Berber Revolt, the Abbasid Revolution, the internal fragmentation of Umayyad power, suggests that the answer to that question was almost certainly no, regardless of what happened on the plain of Poitiers. The armies lying on opposite sides of that field in October of 732 CE were both, in ways that neither fully knew, operating at the edge of their respective capacities. Charles's army was a coalition of Frankish lords who followed him as long as his victories justified their followership, and no longer. Abd al-Rahman's force was the leading edge of an empire that was already below the surface of its imposing facade, beginning to crack. What met on that field was not, in the end, the destiny of Western civilization against the destiny of Islamic civilization. It was two very human institutions, two armies, with all of the fear and supply problems and internal tensions and contingent decisions that armies always have, meeting in a specific place at a specific time, and the outcome turning on decisions made in moments of confusion and fear and the chaotic darkness of medieval battle. History is made by people who do not know that they are making history. They are too cold, too hungry, too afraid, too focused on the immediate problem of survival to understand that the morning they are living through will eventually be cited in books that will not be written for 1,000 years. This is one of the most important and most commonly forgotten truths about the past, that the people in it were not participants in a narrative. They were people, living as people live, muddling through, doing the best they could with incomplete information and limited resources, and the persistent human capacity to be both extraordinarily capable and staggeringly short-sighted simultaneously. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi was a capable administrator and military commander. He had governed Al-Andalus with a reasonable degree of effectiveness. He had organized a large-scale military operation with considerable logistical complexity. He almost certainly went to his death somewhere in the confusion of that October engagement without knowing that his name would be remembered 12 centuries later in a history that would frame his campaign as a near catastrophe for Western civilization. He was trying to hold his cavalry together and respond to a rumor about his supply camp and maintain cohesion in a battle that had gone wrong. He was a man doing a very difficult job that suddenly became impossible. This is the level at which history actually happens. Not in the cosmic clash of civilizations, but in the specific, granular, frightened decisions of specific, granular, frightened people. And it is worth returning to this level regularly, when the mythology becomes too grand, when the narrative too easily sorts itself into darkness and light, before we can fully understand the man who stood on that October ridge. We need to understand the world he stood inside, not the grand sweep of empires and centuries, but the smaller, more intimate world of the Frankish kingdom in the early 8th century. What did it look like to be a person of power in that world? What were the textures of daily political life? What did survival mean? The Frankish kingdom of the early 700s CE was not a state in any sense that the Roman Empire would have recognized. It was a network of personal loyalties, backed by force and reinforced by religion, in which authority flowed not from institutions but from individuals, from the personal prestige, the military record, the generosity, and the feared reputation of specific lords and their households. The king, in this system, was theoretically supreme. In practice, he was supreme only for as long as the people around him believed he was and behaved accordingly. This is why the Merovingian kings of the late 7th and early 8th centuries, the do-nothing kings, as they were later called, somewhat unfairly, had lost real power. They had not lost it because of personal inadequacy, though some were personally inadequate. They had lost it because the structure of Frankish political authority was not designed to sustain centralized royal power without continuous military success and political management. The great noble families of the Frankish periphery, Aquitaine, Burgundy, Bavaria, had built up their own local power bases and were increasingly difficult to compel with anything less than the full military force of the Frankish heartland. Charles Martel's achievement was to reassemble that full military force, to point it consistently in the right directions, and to keep winning. Winning, in the early medieval world, was the primary source of political legitimacy. A lord who won battles could keep his followers and attract new ones. A lord who lost battles, lost followers, and eventually lost everything. This is why Charles fought as continuously as he did, not from some psychological compulsion toward violence, but because, in the world he inhabited, sustained victory was the only way to maintain the power to do anything else. The Frankish Church was both his most important ally and his most complicated relationship. The bishops and abbots of the Frankish kingdom controlled enormous wealth land, primarily accumulated over 2 centuries of donations from aristocratic families seeking divine intercession for themselves and their heirs. This wealth was the financial foundation of Christian culture in the West, the resource base from which monasteries produced manuscripts. Bishops funded construction, and the network of Christian community and charity that was one of the few organizing institutions in a world without Roman administrative infrastructure was maintained. Charles needed that wealth for his armies. He took it through a practice called praecaria, verbo regis, granting church lands to warriors on a temporary basis in exchange for military service, theoretically with the church's consent, but often without it in any meaningful sense. The bishops complained, some condemned him. Charles continued. The warriors fought. The armies held together through the campaigns of the 720s and into the crisis of 732 CE. This is the man who assembled on the ridge near Poitiers, not a saint, not a simple soldier, a political operator of extraordinary sophistication, managing a coalition of competing interests under conditions of military emergency, using every resource available to him, including resources that were not quite his to use, holding together a kingdom that had every reason to fall apart by being, at every moment, exactly as formidable as he needed to be. When Odo of Aquitaine arrived at his court, fleeing Abbot al-Rahman's cavalry and asking for help, Charles looked at a man he had spent years fighting and saw an opportunity. He agreed to help. He marched south with his assembled forces. He chose his ground. He waited. He knew what he was doing. He knew why he was doing it. He knew that the story told about him afterward would be simpler than the truth, because the stories told about victors always are. He probably didn't mind. His name was Charles. He had been born sometime around 688 CE to Pepin of Herstal, the mayor of the palace of the Frankish kingdom, and a concubine whose name the historical sources record as Alpeta. The circumstances of his birth were, by the standards of the Frankish aristocracy, complicated. He was not a legitimate heir in the clear, uncontested sense. He had half-brothers who disputed his inheritance. When his father died in 714 CE, he was thrown into prison by his father's widow, who had her own candidate for the position of power. He escaped. He raised an army. He fought his way through several years of civil conflict against rival Frankish factions, his own stepmother, and the external enemies who always seemed to find the right moment to press their advantage against a kingdom distracted by internal war. By 718 CE, he was the undisputed master of the Frankish kingdom. He was never the king of that kingdom. The kings of the Franks were, in this period, members of the Merovingian dynasty, a family whose founders had built the Frankish kingdom out of the ruins of Roman Gaul in the late 400s CE, and whose later representatives had become by the early 700s, largely ceremonial figures. The real power, the power to raise armies, to tax, to conduct foreign policy, to make war, had migrated into the hands of the mayors of the palace, the chief ministers, who managed the royal household and, in doing so, managed the kingdom. Charles held this office with a tenacity and a skill that left no room for doubt about who was actually in charge. To understand Charles is to resist, at every step, the legend that was built around him after his death. The legend says this: Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. The name he was given posthumously was the defender of Christendom, the providential figure who stood between a spreading Islamic empire and the complete Islamicization of Europe. He is framed in the historical memory that runs from the Carolingian court historians through Edward Gibbon, through 9th century nationalist historians, into the present day, as a man of almost singular historical purpose. He was put in this place, at this time, to perform this function. The reality is considerably more interesting and considerably more human. Charles was, at the time of the Battle of Tours, a warlord in the process of consolidating political power. He was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, not just against the Muslim forces pushing up from the south, but against Frankish regional lords who resisted his centralization of authority, against the Saxons pressing from the north and east, against the Frisians along the coastal lowlands, against the Bavarians and Alemanni, and the various other peoples whose tribal interests and political ambitions were constantly in tension with the idea of a unified Frankish realm under a single strong hand. He was also, and this detail has a certain dark comedy to it, funding his military campaigns partly by seizing the properties of the church, the same church whose shrines the Muslim raiders had been sacking and whose bishops' collars would eventually celebrate his victory at Tours as a divine miracle. Charles was never formally excommunicated, though some historical sources suggest he came close. The bishops of the Frankish Church understood his military necessity. They also watched him redistribute their land to his warriors, with an expression that history has not preserved but imagination can supply. When Odo of Aquitaine arrived at Charles's court in 732 CE, fleeing the destruction of his army by Abd al-Rahman and seeking help, he was asking for assistance from a man he had spent years opposing. Odo had, until very recently, been an ally of the Umayyad rulers of the south against Charles. He had sheltered a Berber rebel chief. He had played the politics of regional autonomy against the centralizing ambitions of the Frankish north. Now, with Abd al-Rahman's cavalry burning their way through his lands, Odo needed Charles, and Charles, with the clarity of a man who never missed a political opportunity, agreed to help on terms that effectively ended Odo's independence. This is worth holding for a moment. The army that assembled to face the Muslim forces at Tours was not simply a Christian coalition defending a faith. It was, among other things, the instrument by which Charles absorbed Aquitaine into his political sphere of influence. Helping Odo was also, and perhaps primarily, an act of Frankish state-building. None of this is to say that Charles was indifferent to the religious dimensions of the conflict. He wasn't. The sacking of St. Martin's Basilica at Tours had a significance that was simultaneously symbolic, political, and economic, and all three of those dimensions mattered to Charles in ways that were inseparable from each other. The Church was a pillar of Frankish political authority. The great pilgrimage sites were economic engines. The idea of a Christian kingdom had a legitimating function that even a man as pragmatic as Charles understood and used. He was not a hypocrite precisely. He was a medieval warlord, operating in a world where religious and political identity were genuinely fused, where there was no clean separation between fighting for God and fighting for political survival, because in that world they were the same fight. But he was fighting for the survival of his kingdom and his political project first. The theological framing came later, applied by the people who had reasons to want that framing, primarily his descendants, the Carolingian dynasty, who needed a founder hero, and the clerical scholars who had every reason to celebrate the man who had, whatever else he might have done to church property, defended the church against an external enemy. The name Martel, the hammer, almost certainly came after his death. It was a name given to him by the tradition that grew around his memory, the same tradition that was simultaneously building his grandson Charlemagne into the figure of the ideal Christian emperor. Every dynasty needs its founding legend. The Carolingians needed Charles to be a providential figure, a man marked by God for a specific purpose, because that retroactive marking legitimized everything that came after him, including the creation of what would eventually become the Holy Roman Empire. Retrospective heroism is one of the most reliable features of human political psychology. We consistently reframe past actors as more ideologically pure, more consciously purposeful, more aligned with the causes we need them to represent than the evidence of their lives actually supports. Charles probably woke up on the morning of that October battle worried about the same things that military commanders have always worried about: whether his supply lines would hold, whether the Frankish lords on his flanks would stay committed when the fighting became difficult, whether the ground he had chosen would serve his infantry against an enemy whose primary strength was cavalry. He had, in fact, chosen the ground with considerable care. This is one of the things the historical record genuinely supports, that Charles selected a position on wooded, hilly terrain that significantly limited the effectiveness of the Umayyad cavalry. The Muslim forces under Abd al-Rahman were powerful precisely because of their horse warriors, fast, mobile, devastating in open terrain. Charles forced them to fight on ground where that mobility was constrained, where the Frankish infantry could form their shield wall without being flanked or broken by charging horsemen. This was not the work of a divine instrument. This was the work of an experienced military commander who had been fighting for his life and his power for 20 years and knew exactly what he needed to do to give himself the best chance of winning. The picture that emerges when you look at Charles Martel without the Carolingian mythological frame is of a man who was formidably capable, politically ruthless, militarily gifted, personally ambitious, willing to seize church properties and fight Christian rivals without compunction, and entirely capable of also believing, at some genuine level, that his victories were sanctioned by God. These qualities are not contradictory. They are, in fact, the profile of most of the people who have ever shaped the course of history. What Charles Martel was not was a simple hero standing between civilization and darkness. He was a complex political actor who fought a battle for complex, mixed reasons, won it through genuine military skill and careful tactical preparation, and was then transformed by the needs of later centuries into something simpler and more usable. The transformation tells us something important, and we will return to it. But first, we need to actually look at the battle. 7 days on that cold October plain, an army that was killed in significant number and then withdrew. And the question that historians have been arguing about for 12 centuries, did it actually change anything? The military culture that Charles Martel commanded had been forged over 2 centuries of the particular kind of warfare that characterized the post-Roman West, a warfare of raids and counter-raids, of seasonal campaigns in which armies moved fast and lived off the land and returned home before winter made movement impossible, of personal combat and small unit tactics and the political dynamics of a warrior aristocracy whose loyalty was always, at some level, conditional on victory and plunder. What Charles did, over the course of his long consolidation of Frankish power, was impose a degree of organizational coherence on this culture that it had not previously had. He built a professional military household, the comitatus, the following of sworn warriors who served him directly and formed the disciplined core around which the larger coalition army assembled for major campaigns. He rewarded military service with land grants that created a lasting bond of obligation. He enforced discipline in a way that Frankish military culture had not consistently experienced. The military innovation most associated with Charles, the argument that he introduced or significantly developed the use of heavy cavalry, anticipating the nightly warfare of the high medieval period, is actually contested among historians. What is less contested is that the force he assembled for the engagement at Poitiers was primarily heavy infantry, and that its performance against Umayyad cavalry suggests a level of discipline and tactical cohesion that Charles had spent years developing. The ground he chose was not an accident. The ridge south of Poitiers, with its wooded flanks and its limited approaches, was exactly the kind of terrain that would force a cavalry-heavy army to engage on foot infantry terms. Charles had scouted it. He had positioned his forces to use it. He was doing what skilled military commanders have always done, manipulating the conditions of the engagement so that his strengths were matched against his opponent's weaknesses. This tactical intelligence is sometimes lost in the mythological framing, which prefers the image of divine intervention to the more prosaic explanation of careful preparation. But the preparation is, in its own way, more impressive than the miracle. Charles did not need God to arrange the terrain for him. He arranged it himself. The men who stood in the Frankish shield wall that October, the infantry who held their ground against the Umayyad cavalry charges, were not, for the most part, religious warriors defending a theological abstraction. They were, in the main, men who had been fighting under Charles or his predecessors for years. Men whose livelihoods and safety depended on the political order that Charles represented. Men who understood, at the level of practical self-interest, that losing this battle meant losing everything they had built and held. The religious dimension of their motivation was real. Faith was not a performance in the medieval world. It was the water that everything swam in, but it was inseparable from the more immediate concerns of survival and loyalty and the defense of land that was specifically theirs. Among the Frankish lords who fought under Charles at Tours, there was almost certainly a range of levels of commitment. The lords who had been most recently subdued by Charles, who had only recently transferred their nominal allegiance to his authority, probably fought with something less than pure ideological fervor. They fought because the alternative was worse. This is how most coalitions maintain themselves in the field, not through shared conviction, but through the mutual calculation that fighting together is preferable to the consequences of not fighting together. Charles knew this. He had spent 20 years managing exactly this kind of coalition. He knew which lords he could trust and which he needed to watch. He knew where the weak points in his line were likely to be and who needed to be positioned near them to stiffen the resolve of those around him. He was a manager of men as much as a commander of armies, and the management was as important as the command. After the battle, after the Umayyad withdrawal, after the Frankish scouts returned to report the abandoned camp, there was a moment of uncertainty. The Muslim army had not been destroyed. It had withdrawn in good order. It would return to al. It would fight again in other places and other seasons. And Charles, despite his victory, faced the return journey with the same coalition of fractious lords and the same political tensions that he had brought to the fight. Victory does not simplify politics. It sometimes complicates it. The lords who had fought under Charles now had claims on his gratitude, claims on land and privilege, and the recognition that military service in the medieval world always generated. Charles had to manage these claims carefully. He had to consolidate the victory politically, which was harder than militarily. He did this. He always did this. The victory at Tours was absorbed into the ongoing project of Frankish state building that was the actual work of Charles Martel's life. It was a significant moment in that project, a moment that strengthened his prestige, confirmed his authority over Aquitaine, and demonstrated to the regional lords of the Frankish world that his military leadership was indispensable. But it was a moment in a project that had been ongoing for 20 years and would continue for another 14 until Charles died in 741 CE and left his consolidated kingdom to his sons. He was buried at the Basilica of St. Denis, the great Frankish royal burial church. No king was buried there in his lifetime. He was buried there because, by the end of his life, the distinction between the mayor of the palace and the king was purely formal. His son, Pepin III, would formalize what was already true, deposing the last Merovingian and having himself crowned king with papal blessing. His grandson would be crowned emperor. The arc of Charles Martel's legacy is inseparable from the arc of Carolingian power, and the mythology of Tours was always partly a retrospective justification for that arc, a story about how the dynasty began in divine sanction, how its founder was chosen by history and by God to perform a task of civilizational importance. The mythology served. Mythologies that serve tend to endure. In the days before the engagement, the two armies occupied a kind of suspended present, the strange temporal quality of military standoff, in which each hour is both ordinary and weighted with the possibility of violence. Men cleaned equipment that was already clean. Commanders consulted subordinates they had already consulted. The medieval night, without artificial light, closed in early and completely, and in that darkness each army was alone with whatever it carried inside itself. What the Umayyad soldiers carried was the memory of a campaign that had gone well for months. They had crossed the Pyrenees in good order. They had defeated Odo of Aquitaine in open battle. They had plundered the rich Basilica of St. Martin and accumulated considerable wealth in the form of portable goods, gold, silver, textiles, livestock that was now in their camp. They were far from home, deep in territory that did not welcome them, but they had been far from home and in hostile territory before and had prevailed. They had the psychology of an army that had not, in living memory, been stopped. What the Frankish soldiers carried was the weight of necessity. This was their territory. The burned churches and plundered monasteries that Abd al-Rahman's campaign had left behind it were not abstractions. They were the churches where these men had been baptized, where their children had been baptized, where their dead were buried in ground that had been consecrated by priests who had spent their lives in the specific places that the raiding had reduced to ash. The defense of this ground was not a theological argument. It was a visceral, specific, personal stake. And over both armies, in the particular way that October nights fall in central France, with a coldness that is not yet winter, but that carries winter's promise, lay the stars and the silence and the absolute indifference of the universe to the outcome of what was about to happen. In the medieval world, this indifference was impossible to believe in. Both armies had priests. Both armies had, embedded in the structure of their belief systems, the conviction that God was watching, that the outcome of the battle would be, at some level, a reflection of divine judgment. This belief was not superstition, exactly. It was the organizing principle of both civilizations. The Frankish soldiers prayed to Christ for victory. The Umayyad soldiers moved in the framework of a faith that understood the expansion of the Islamic community as itself a form of divine will in action. Both sides believed the morning would reveal something about God's intentions. We know, from our 12th century vantage point, what the morning revealed, but they did not. And in not knowing, they were more fully human than the myth allows them to be. They were afraid. They were hopeful. They were cold. They were, in the way that all human beings on the eve of uncertain and dangerous events are, intensely present in the simple fact of their own existence, aware of the warmth of the body, the sound of breathing, the particular quality of the quiet that precedes something irreversible. This is the history that cannot be fully recovered. Not the tactics and the political contexts and the long-term consequences, but the experience of being there, in that cold, waiting for the light. We can only approach it obliquely. We can only stand at the edge of it and acknowledge what we cannot enter. But standing at that edge is itself something. It is the acknowledgement that the past was not populated by symbols and archetypes, but by people. By the specific, irreducible, mortal fact of individual human consciousness facing the uncertain morning. That acknowledgement is what separates history from mythology, and it is worth making, always, before we resume the analysis. The sources for the Battle of Tours are, to be generous, uneven. The most contemporary account comes from the Mozarabic Chronicle of 754 CE, written by a Christian living under Muslim rule in Al-Andalus, roughly 2 decades after the battle. It describes the engagement and notes the death of Abd al-Rahman. It does not, notably, describe the battle as a world historical turning point. It describes it as a significant engagement with notable consequences, the drama, the cosmic framing, the sense that civilization itself was balanced on a knife's edge that comes later. Frankish chronicles of the period give the engagement meaningful attention, but they too lack the apocalyptic register that later centuries would apply. The word that the Frankish sources use, and that subsequent historians would linger over with great pleasure, is the Arabic phrase that the Mozarabic Chronicle applies to the Frankish forces. They were called a people of Europe, Europenses. It is one of the earliest uses of the word European in any source to describe the people of what we now call Europe as a coherent cultural bloc. The battle, in a small linguistic way, may have contributed to the invention of European identity as a category, which is itself a remarkable and underappreciated detail. But let us look at the battle itself. For approximately a week in October of 732 CE, the exact dates are not preserved with precision, the two armies faced each other in a posture of mutual assessment that was common to medieval engagements. Neither side attacked immediately. This was not cowardice. This was the standard operational logic of the period. You watched, you probed, you looked for weakness, you waited for terrain or weather or your opponent's impatience to give you an advantage. Charles held the high ground on wooded terrain. Abd al-Rahman's cavalry needed open space to operate effectively. Neither condition was going to change quickly. When the Umayyad cavalry finally charged, the Frankish infantry held. The shield wall, the disciplined formation of heavy infantry standing their ground against mounted attack, was one of the defining military technologies of the Frankish armies, and Charles had spent years refining it. The Umayyad horses broke against a line that did not break back. At some point during the fighting, a rumor spread through the Umayyad ranks that the Frankish forces were raiding the Muslim camp, threatening the plunder that Abd al-Rahman's army had accumulated in its months of raiding through Aquitaine. Some of the Muslim cavalry broke away from the main engagement to return to the camp and protect their goods. This created disorder. Abd al-Rahman tried to rally his forces. In the chaos, he was killed in the press of the fighting by Frankish warriors who, the sources suggest, surrounded him. With their commander dead and their formation broken, the Umayyad forces withdrew. They withdrew in good order. This was not a rout, and they pulled back, south, away from the Frankish army, away from the terrain where their cavalry had been neutered. Charles advanced to the camp and found it, apparently, largely abandoned. He did not pursue. He let them go. The next morning, as the Frankish scouts crept forward, expecting to resume the fight, they found the Muslim camp empty. The army was gone. Abd al-Rahman was buried somewhere on that plain in a grave that history has never precisely located. The fighting had lasted, at most, a single day of significant engagement, after perhaps a week of watching. The total duration of the campaign encounter was roughly a week. This is not, in the military history of the medieval period, an unusually long engagement. It was a significant battle. A governor was killed. A large force withdrew. The raiding of Frankish territory, for this season at least, was over. And then, what happened next? Here is where the historical story becomes genuinely complicated, and where the received narrative begins to quietly contradict itself. The conventional framing, and this framing runs from Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776 through virtually every Western history textbook written before 1980, is that the Battle of Tours was the decisive moment that permanently reversed the tide of Islamic expansion into Western Europe. Abd al-Rahman was killed, the Muslim forces retreated, and the Pyrenea frontier held thereafter. Europe was saved. Gibbon's famous speculation that had Charles Martel lost, the mosques of London and Oxford might have risen, and the Quran might be taught from the pulpits of European universities, is one of the most quoted sentences in all of Western historical writing. It is also, it must be said, a sentence that reveals considerably more about the anxieties of 18th century Protestant England than it does about the military realities of 8th century Europe. Consider what actually happened in the years following the battle. The Muslim forces did not simply go home and stay there. Raids and military operations into southern Gaul continued for years afterward. Narbonne, which had been under Muslim control since 719 CE, did not fall to Frankish forces until 759 CE, 27 years after Tours. The Umayyad forces remained in control of significant parts of what is now southern France for the better part of 3 decades after the battle that supposedly decisively defeated them. Al-Andalus, the Muslim-governed portions of the Iberian Peninsula, did not collapse or weaken significantly after Tours. It thrived. Cordoba, its capital city, would become by the 10th century arguably the most intellectually sophisticated city in all of Western Europe. Its libraries, its scholars, its physicians, its mathematicians, these were the institutions through which ancient Greek philosophy was preserved and transmitted back to Christian Europe during the centuries when the Frankish and Germanic kingdoms were struggling to maintain basic literacy. The Islamic civilization that the Battle of Tours supposedly stopped from conquering Europe continued to be, for several centuries afterward, Europe's most important intellectual neighbor and, in many ways, its teacher. So if the battle did not eliminate Muslim power in Western Europe, and if Al-Andalus continued to flourish for 7 centuries after Tours, what exactly did the battle decide? The historian Alessandro Barbero, who has written extensively on the Carolingian period, argues that the engagement at Tours should be understood primarily in its immediate strategic context as a successful defense against a specific raiding force, not as the decisive halt of a sustained invasion. The forces under Abdo al-Rahman were not, Barbero suggests, a colonial army with the supply infrastructure, siege capabilities, and logistical depth that permanent territorial conquest of the Frankish heartland would have required. They were a very large raiding force that had pushed too deep into hostile territory, encountered a prepared enemy on unfavorable ground, lost their commander, and made the sensible decision to withdraw. The historian Paul Davis, in his survey of decisive battles, takes a position closer to the traditional view, arguing that the battle had genuine strategic consequences in discouraging subsequent major pushes north of the Pyrenees. The historian Victor Davis Hanson, writing from a more assertively Western civilization-centric perspective, argues for the battle's world historical significance with considerable passion. The academic debate, but there is a third consideration that neither the traditional nor the revisionist framing adequately addresses, and it concerns what was happening inside the Umayyad Caliphate at exactly this moment, the Berber Revolt. It began in 740 CE to 8 years after Tours. The Berbers of North Africa, who had converted to Islam, fought in the Islamic armies, and been incorporated into the expanding Umayyad world, had been nursing a profound grievance about their second-class status within that world. Arab Muslim elites maintained a hierarchy in which Arab descent carried privileges that converts of non-Arab origin, no matter how devout, no matter how militarily effective, simply did not share. The jizya, the tax on non-Muslims, was sometimes applied to Berber converts as though they had not actually converted. Berber soldiers were assigned the most dangerous positions in military campaigns and received the smallest shares of plunder. The revolt that erupted in 740 CE was not a small disturbance. It was a massive uprising that swept across North Africa, destroyed multiple Umayyad armies sent to suppress it, and fundamentally disrupted the Caliphate's ability to project power westward. The Umayyad forces in Al-Andalus, already stretched thin, found their lines of supply and reinforcement to North Africa severed or threatened. The Caliphate itself entered a period of severe internal crisis. In 750 CE, 18 years after Tours, the Umayyad dynasty was overthrown entirely by the Abbasid Revolution, which moved the center of the Islamic world from Damascus to a new city called Baghdad. In other words, the Islamic expansion into Western Europe was not halted primarily by the Battle of Tours. It was halted by a combination of the Frankish military resistance, the logistical difficulties of projecting power across the Pyrenees into a hostile interior, and crucially, the internal collapse of the Umayyad political order that had been driving the expansion. An empire that was about to experience a devastating internal revolt was not, in retrospect, the unstoppable world-conquering force that the conventional narrative requires it to have been. The Berber revolt was already building, already fermenting in the resentments and the structural injustices of the Umayyad world. In the same years that Abd al-Rahman was riding north through the passes of the Pyrenees, his army was, in a sense, already on its way home, not because of what had happened at Tours, but because of what was happening and was about to happen behind it. History does not move in one direction. It is always, simultaneously, moving in several directions at once. And the turning points it appears to have had are often, on closer examination, coincidences of timing rather than single causes. The plain of Poitiers, the morning after. A stillness that the living on both sides tried to make sense of, and probably could not. Frankish warriors moving through an abandoned camp, cataloging what the retreating army had left behind. The material residue of a campaign that had burned through hundreds of miles of landscape, the dead on both sides. The autumn light arriving without ceremony over a field that would be plowed again in the spring and would remember nothing. Neither side fully understood what had just happened. Neither side could have pursued. The soldier who fights in a battle that will later be called decisive does not feel, in the moment of fighting, the weight of the centuries that have decided to rest on his particular morning. He feels the cold. He feels the fear. He feels the strange, exhausted clarity that arrives after violence, when the mind tries to reassemble the ordinary world from the fragments of an extraordinary one. Abd al-Rahman was dead, buried somewhere in that soil. His name would be remembered. His cause would continue in Al-Andalus for 7 more centuries. The civilization he represented would produce, in the coming centuries, breakthroughs in mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and astronomy that would reach back across the Pyrenees and help drag the Christian kingdoms of Europe out of their long contraction. And the battle he lost would be called, by the people who needed it to be called this, the most important battle in the history of the world. We are now in the territory where the history of an event ends, and the history of how that event was remembered begins. And this second history, the history of the myth, is, in many ways, the more revealing of the two. The aftermath of the Battle of Tours played out over years, not days. And the shape of that aftermath is among the most important pieces of evidence in the historical argument about what the battle actually decided. Narbonne, as noted, remained under Muslim control until 759 CE. The city had been in Umayyad hands since 719 CE, and its recapture by Pepin III Charles, Martel's son, came 27 years after the battle that supposedly permanently reversed the tide. The Muslim governors of Narbonne surrendered not because of military defeat, but because of a political agreement with the city's Visigothic population, who had been chafing under the arrangement and negotiated their own terms. This is the messy, contingent, politically complicated reality of how medieval territorial control actually worked, not in clean, decisive battles, but in slow political negotiations, in the shifting loyalties of local populations, in the patient accumulation of advantage over years and decades. The raiding of southern Gaul continued intermittently through the 730s and 740s. There was no sudden cessation of Umayyad military activity north of the Pyrenees after 730 to CE. What there was a gradual reduction of that activity, driven partly by the increasing military effectiveness of the Frankish opposition, partly by the logistical difficulties of operating so far from the Andalusian base, and partly, crucially, by the internal convulsions that the Umayyad world was experiencing. Al-Andalus itself, after Tours, entered a period of significant internal political turbulence. The governors of al-Andalus, there were 20 of them between 716 and 756 CE, faced constant tensions between Arab and Berber populations, between different Arab tribal factions with competing claims, between the distant authority of Damascus and the practical need to manage an enormously complex multicultural territory. The energy that had driven the expansion north was being consumed by these internal conflicts. In 750 CE, as noted, the Abbasid revolution overthrew the Umayyad dynasty. One Umayyad prince, Abd al-Rahman, escaped the slaughter that accompanied the regime change and made his way to Al-Andalus, where he established an independent emirate in 756 CE. Al-Andalus was no longer part of the Abbasid Caliphate centered in Baghdad. It was a separate political entity, with its own ambitions and its own challenges, none of which involved further expansion into the Frankish north. The intellectual culture of Al-Andalus in the century after Tours was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The city of Cordoba, which became the capital of Abd al-Rahman, the first's emirate, grew over the following century into a city of several 100,000 people, larger than any contemporary city in Christian Europe, with the possible exception of Constantinople. Its library, the library of the later Umayyad caliphs of Cordoba, reportedly contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts at a time when a wealthy European monastery might possess a few dozen books. Its scholars were translating and commenting on Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Euclid, and Ptolemy. Its physicians were practicing a medicine that was centuries ahead of anything available north of the Pyrenees. The transmission of this knowledge northward through translated texts, through scholarly exchanges, through the slow seepage of ideas across borders that could never be entirely sealed, is one of the great unacknowledged stories of medieval European history. The 12th century Renaissance of Western Europe, the rediscovery of classical philosophy that would eventually contribute to the intellectual conditions for the actual Renaissance, was significantly driven by the recovery of Greek and Arabic texts from Al-Andalus. The civilization that the Battle of Tours supposedly prevented from conquering Europe was, in the centuries after that battle, engaged in the intellectual transformation of Europe through entirely non-military means. This is the great irony that the mythology of Tours tends to suppress. The idea that Islamic civilization was the enemy that was kept out at Poitiers, the darkness held back by Charles Martel's shield wall, cannot survive an honest accounting of what Islamic civilization actually contributed to the making of medieval and modern Europe. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, agriculture, architecture, the intellectual and material content of the Islamic Golden Age flowed into Europe through the very Iberian Peninsula that the mythology identifies as the site of the near catastrophe. The enemy and the teacher were, in the end, the same civilization. The battle and the transmission of knowledge were, in the end, happening simultaneously in the same geography, involving the same peoples. History is not simple enough to have pure enemies. It is not clean enough to have pure saving moments. It is a tangle of exchange and conflict and mutual influence that the mythology of the decisive battle tends, of necessity, to simplify. The bones of Abadeh, al-Rahman, Olgafiki lie somewhere in the soil of the Vienne Valley. No one knows exactly where. The grave was never marked in a way that survived the centuries. This is a common fate for the defeated. The victors build monuments, inscribe names on stone, maintain the memory that serves their purposes. The defeated sink into the earth and are remembered, if at all, as the enemies of the people who won. The Mozarabic Chronicle of 754 CE, written by a Christian living under Muslim rule in Al-Andalus, refers to him with a certain respect as a worthy adversary, a capable leader, a man who died doing what he believed in. The author of that chronicle was writing from a position that the mythology of Tours tends to obscure, the position of a Christian who lived and, by many accounts, benefited from the civilization that the mythology frames as the enemy of Christian civilization. The Christians of Al-Andalus, the Mozarabs, were not enslaved or forcibly converted. They practiced their faith, maintained their communities, and participated in the intellectual and cultural life of one of the most sophisticated societies in the medieval world. Their experience complicates the narrative of civilizational clash that Tours is so often invoked to support. They were Christians who lived mostly peacefully in an Islamic polity, meant in the centuries after the battle that supposedly had to be won to prevent exactly this. Their existence is the historical evidence that the worst-case scenario, the total absorption of Christian Europe into the Islamic world, was never quite what the mythology required it to be. There is a way of thinking about history that treats it as a record of what happened. The events, the dates, the sequence of causes and effects. This is history as archive, precious, necessary, irreplaceable. But there is another layer beneath the archive, running deeper and in some ways more powerfully, that determines which events are remembered, how they are framed, what they are said to mean, and why they resurface with such regularity in political and cultural discourse long after the people who lived them are dust. This is history as collective memory, not what happened, but what a community of people needs to have happened. And it is in this layer that the Battle of Tours has had its most durable and most consequential life. The German scholar Jan Assmann, in his work on cultural memory, distinguished between what he called communicative memory, the living memory of a generation passed through direct experience and testimony, and cultural memory, the formalized, ritualized, often mythologized memory that a society maintains over centuries to define its identity and justify its existence. The Battle of Tours entered cultural memory almost immediately, and it has never quite left. In the Carolingian chronicles of the late 8th and 9th centuries, the texts written by scholars who served or celebrated the dynasty that Charles Martel had effectively founded, the battle takes on its first mythological shape. Charles is the defender of Christendom. The Muslim forces are the enemies of the faith. The victory is evidence of divine favor for the Frankish people and their rulers. The battle's significance is retrospectively magnified by the fact that Charles's grandson, Charlemagne, will be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 CE, an event that seems, in retrospect, to have been set in motion by the legitimacy his grandfather earned at Tours. This Carolingian framing was not cynical propaganda, exactly. It was the natural language of its time and place, a world in which political legitimacy and divine favor were understood as inseparable, in which the meaning of events was always partly theological. But it was also narratively useful in ways that the Carolingian court was quite capable of recognizing. A dynasty needs a founding legend. The legend of Charles Martel, the Hammer of God, served that function with admirable efficiency. The battle remained a point of reference in medieval Christian scholarship throughout the following centuries. Though its prominence fluctuated, it was one of many battles, many turning points, many moments of divine deliverance in a medieval world that found divine intervention everywhere it looked. The battle's transformation into a civilizational myth, into the decisive moment that saved Western civilization as such, rather than merely one Christian victory against one Muslim force in one particular autumn, happened primarily in the 18th and 19th centuries. And to understand why, you need to understand what the 18th and 19th centuries were anxious about. Edward Gibbon published the first volume of his History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, the same year that the American colonies declared independence and the French Enlightenment was reaching its most turbulent phase. Gibbon was a product of the Enlightenment sensibility, skeptical of revealed religion, impressed by classical civilization, troubled by what he saw as the barbarism and superstition that had followed Rome's collapse. His treatment of the Battle of Tours reflects these anxieties. The Islamic forces represent, in his framing, a kind of overwhelming religious fanaticism threatening the rational order that classical civilization represented. Charles Martel stands against this tide. Had he failed, Gibbon suggests, the Saracens might have sailed up the Thames, the Quran might be taught in Oxford. This famous speculation has done more to shape the popular understanding of Tours than any actual historical analysis. It is also, it should be noted, historically implausible on its face. The logistical realities of projecting military power from the Arabian Peninsula to the British Isles in the 8th century were, shall we say, formidable. But Gibbon was not making a logistical argument. He was making an anxiety argument. He was saying, this is the kind of thing that could happen to us. This is how close we came. This is why the line must hold. The 19th century amplified this framing to an extraordinary degree. Sir Edward Creasy's 15 Decisive Battles of the World, published in 1851, included the Battle of Tours as one of the pivotal engagements in the history of human civilization. Creasy's book was enormously influential. It shaped the historical education of several generations of English-speaking readers, and its framing of Tours was unambiguous. This was the battle that decided whether Europe would be Christian or Muslim, whether Western civilization would survive or be absorbed into the Saracen world. The year 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park, the celebration of British industrial and imperial supremacy, the year when Britain governed the largest empire in human history, when France was engaged in the violent colonization of Algeria, when European powers were carving Africa and Asia into spheres of influence and extraction. The 19th century needed historical precedents for its civilizational self-confidence. It needed a story in which Europe, Christian, rational, industrious Europe, had always been, at its core, something distinct from and superior to the world it was colonizing. The Battle of Tours, reframed as the decisive victory of Western civilization over Eastern fanaticism, provided exactly this story. This is not a coincidence. The mythologization of Tours reached its peak precisely at the moment when European imperial powers needed a founding. narrative for the civilizational hierarchy they were constructing. History is always also politics. The battles we celebrate, the heroes we construct, the turning points we identify, these are never simply historical judgments. They are political acts. They serve present needs. They answer present fears. The American psychologist Sheldon Solomon, building on the work of the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, developed what is called terror management theory, the idea that much of human cultural activity, including the construction of historical and civilizational narratives, is motivated by the management of the fundamental anxiety that human beings experience about their own mortality. We cannot live with the raw knowledge of our individual deaths, and so we construct symbolic systems, religions, nations, cultures, historical myths that allow us to participate in something larger than ourselves, something that will outlast us, something that transforms our individual fragility into collective permanence. Civilizations, terror management theory would suggest, need their founding myths of survival precisely because civilizations, like individuals, are mortal and know it. The myth of Tours is, among other things, a story about a civilization telling itself that it deserves to persist, that it came close to the edge and was pulled back, that its survival was not accidental but meaningful, that something essential was preserved in that cold October field that would have been lost forever if the line had broken. This is a deeply human need, and it is a need that has made the Battle of Tours enormously useful to an extraordinary range of political projects. Across 12 centuries, medieval Christians invoked Tours as evidence of divine providence, God's ongoing protection of his chosen people. Enlightenment historians invoked it as evidence of rational European orders, superiority over religious fanaticism. 19th century nationalists invoked it as evidence of European racial destiny. 20th century Cold Warriors occasionally invoked it as part of a broader narrative about the defense of Western civilization against ideological enemies. And in the 21st century, the battle has been invoked, with varying degrees of historical literacy, in debates about immigration, Islam, multiculturalism, and European identity that have nothing directly to do with 732 CE, but that reach back to that morning on the plain of Poitiers for a usable past. Each of these invocations tells us something important. Not about what happened in 732 CE. The battle itself remains stubbornly ambiguous, stubbornly resistant to the meanings that have been imposed on it, but about the people doing the invoking. The version of Tours that any particular era reaches for is a mirror. It reflects the fears, the anxieties, the political projects, the identity needs of that era far more faithfully than it reflects the actual experience of the Frankish infantry standing in their shield wall on that October morning. In-group and out-group construction is one of the most ancient and reliable features of human political psychology. We define ourselves partly by defining who we are not. The Battle of Tours has served, across its long afterlife, as a site for exactly this kind of identity construction. But the identity being constructed has shifted with every generation that has used the battle. Charles Martel fought as a Frank. The Carolingian chroniclers celebrated him as a Christian. The 19th century celebrated him as a European. Some 21st century voices have tried to claim him as something else again. The us that was supposedly saved at Tours has been continuously reconstructed according to the needs of whoever is doing the saving. The battle, in this sense, is less a historical event than a political resource, a claim that can be staked and restaked, a precedent that can be cited and recited, a mirror that reflects back whatever the person holding it needs to see. This observation is not relativism. It is not the claim that nothing happened in October of 732 CE, or that the battle had no real consequences. It clearly did have consequences. Some version of the Frankish political project survived and eventually produced the Carolingian dynasty and the framework of what we now call Western Europe. Charles Martel was a real man who made real tactical decisions that had real outcomes. The Umayyad forces really withdrew, and the raiding of the Frankish interior from the south was significantly curtailed in the decades that followed. But the claim that the battle was the most important engagement in the history of Western civilization, that without Charles Martel's victory, the history of Europe would have been unrecognizably different, that Islam would have swallowed the continent, that the cathedrals of Paris and the universities of Oxford and the poems of Dante and the paintings of the Sistine Chapel would never have existed. This claim is a mythological construction, not a historical one. It requires us to know with certainty how a battle that did not happen would have unfolded, what a victory that did not occur would have led to, how a civilization that was already experiencing severe internal fractures would have managed the additional burden of controlling a vast and hostile European interior. History does not run counterfactuals cleanly. The comforting certainty of the decisive moment, the before and the after, the line that held and the darkness it held back, is a narrative convenience, not an empirical finding. And yet, we need these stories. This is the thing that is easy to forget when the analytical mind gets going, when the historian's proper skepticism is doing its necessary work of clearing away the mythology. We need them not because they are accurate, but because they are functional, because the human mind, confronting the genuine chaos and contingency of historical causation, requires organizing narratives, requires the moment of decision, requires the figure who stands in the breach, requires the morning that held the Battle of Thermopylae, the Mongol typhoons that the Japanese called the Divine Wind, the kamikaze, the victory of the Athenians at Marathon, the English longbowmen at Agincourt. Every civilization has its tours, the moment that supposedly preserved everything that came after, the near miss that justifies the existence of the people who survived it. These myths are not simply lies told by propagandists. They are also stories that communities tell themselves to maintain the will and the cohesion to keep going through the ordinary, grinding, inglorious difficulty of collective existence. The question is not whether we need them. The question is whether we can hold them while also holding the more complicated truth, whether we can know that Tours was partly mythologized and still feel the significance of what happened on that cold plain, whether we can see Charles Martel as a warlord and a political opportunist and also acknowledge that he did something remarkable, whether we can understand that the Islamic forces were human beings with their own reasonable understanding of the world and their own fears and ambitions, and not merely a monolithic darkness pressing against a monolithic light. The question is whether we can do what the most honest and capacious kind of historical understanding requires. Hold the myth and the complexity simultaneously. Let both be true in their different registers, and refuse the comfort of the version that requires everything to be simple. Every civilization has its tours. Every organized human community, at some point in its history, identifies a moment of near extinction from which it was saved, a battle or a storm or a plague or a political crisis that, had it gone the other way, would have meant the end of everything that came after. These moments of preserved existence are among the most powerful organizing myths that communities tell themselves, and they share certain structural features that are worth examining. They are almost always retrospectively magnified. The contemporaries who lived through them generally understood them as significant, but not necessarily as world historical. It is the later generations, looking back and calculating what would have been lost if the outcome had been different, who assign them their cosmic weight. They are almost always simplified in the retelling. The actual complexity of the situation, the mixed motivations, the contingent decisions, the alternative paths that existed but were not taken, is smoothed into a cleaner narrative of heroic defense against threatening darkness. And they are almost always politically useful in ways that outlast their original context. The myth of Marathon was still being invoked by Greek orators 5 centuries after the battle. The myth of Thermopylae has been invoked in every century since the Spartans died there. The myth of Tours has been continuously recycled through 12 centuries of European political thought. The Japanese narrative of the kamikaze, the divine winds that destroyed the Mongol fleets attempting to invade Japan in 1274 and 1281 CE, serves an almost identical function to the Western narrative of Tours. It is the story of a civilization that faced overwhelming external threat and was saved at the last moment by what could only be interpreted as divine intervention. The fact that the typhoons that destroyed the Mongol fleets were natural meteorological events did not prevent the Japanese from reading them as evidence of the special relationship between the Japanese islands and the divine powers that protected them. The story of divine protection was too useful to set aside in favor of accurate meteorology. The Song dynasty of China had its own version, the survival of Chinese civilization against the Mongol conquest that destroyed the Jin dynasty. The fact that the Mongols eventually conquered the Song as well in 1279 CE did not prevent later Chinese dynasties from identifying certain moments of resistance as the founding myths of Chinese cultural persistence. History is generous with usable pasts. It provides something for everyone. What terror management theory helps us understand is that these myths are not simply propaganda, not cynically manufactured stories designed to manipulate credulous populations. They respond to a genuine psychological need, the awareness of collective mortality, the knowledge that civilizations can end and have ended, that the things we value and the communities we belong to are not permanent features of the world, but contingent human constructions that can be destroyed. This awareness is genuinely destabilizing. The myth of the decisive saving moment addresses this anxiety by locating, in the past, evidence that the community has been worth saving, that something chose to preserve it, that its survival was meaningful. This is a deeply human response to a genuinely difficult existential situation, and recognizing it as such, recognizing the psychological function that the myth serves, does not require dismissing the myth as simply false. It requires holding the myth with what we might call informed sympathy, understanding why we need it without letting that need prevent us from also knowing what the history actually says. The 21st century invocations of Tours, and they are numerous, appearing in political speech and editorial writing and online arguments about immigration and the nature of Western civilization with remarkable frequency, are, like all the invocations before them, doing the work of the present while pointing at the past. They are not primarily historical arguments. They are political performances, using a historical reference to make a contemporary claim. The contemporary claim varies widely in its specific content. Some invokers of Tours are arguing for military preparedness, others for immigration restriction, others for what they call the defense of Western values, others for the particular importance of Christian identity in European culture. But they share the underlying structure of using the myth of the decisive saving moment to argue that the same kind of saving needs to happen again right now, from whatever they have identified as the current threat. This is not new. It has been the basic structure of Tours' invocations for 12 centuries. Every generation finds in the battle the enemy it needs and the hero it requires. The enemy is always external. The hero is always one of us. The battle is always the last line of defense. The historian who works with this material has to be careful about two opposite errors. The first error is taking the myth at face value, treating the mythology of Tours as historical analysis and concluding from it that the battle really was the single most important engagement in the history of Western civilization, that Charles Martel was a providential figure, that Islamic civilization was monolithically hostile to European Christian civilization, and that the two were locked in inevitable and permanent conflict. This error makes bad history and, in the 21st century, tends to serve political agendas that do not benefit from accurate historical understanding. The second error is dismissing the battle entirely, concluding from the mythology's exaggerations that nothing of consequence happened at Tours, that the battle was a minor skirmish dressed up in propaganda, that the whole thing is simply an example of the way dominant groups construct founding myths. This error is less common among professional historians, but more common in certain kinds of progressive revisionism, that in correcting the overclaiming of the traditional narrative, overcorrects into a kind of historical minimalism that also serves political purposes, specifically the purpose of delegitimizing the history that the dominant narrative has used to support claims about European civilizational identity. The most honest position is the most uncomfortable one. The battle mattered. The myth grew beyond the battle. The myth served, and continues to serve, political purposes that are separable from, and sometimes at odds with, accurate historical understanding. All three of these things are true simultaneously, and the effort to hold all three simultaneously, without collapsing into either uncritical celebration or dismissive revisionism, is the effort that honest historical thinking requires. It is also, ultimately, the most interesting position to occupy, because it allows you to feel the genuine weight of what happened on that cold October morning. The fear of the men in the shield wall, the confusion of the Umayyad cavalry when their formation broke, the terrible violence of medieval close-quarters combat, the death of a governor who had spent his life building the world he believed in without requiring you to accept the cosmic framing that 12 centuries of mythology has draped over it. You can mourn Abd al-Rahman and respect Charles Martel simultaneously. You can understand that both armies contained human beings doing their best under conditions of extreme uncertainty and danger. You can hold the complexity without losing the weight, and you can look at the way the myth has been used, the ways it has served power, the ways it has simplified what was genuinely complex, the ways it has been invoked to draw lines between peoples that the actual history of medieval exchange between Islamic and Christian Europe does not support, and you can do this without pretending that the battle itself was nothing. History is complicated enough to hold all of it. The question is whether we are. It is autumn in the Vienne Valley, the fields that spread out from the town of Poitiers across the gentle rising of the French interior are pale gold now, the color that comes when the grain has been taken and the earth rests before the cold. A farmer is working somewhere along the far ridge, a small figure in the distance, doing the ancient patient work of preparation for a season that has not yet arrived. There is no monument on this plain that marks precisely where the armies stood. There are commemorations in the town. There are plaques. There are the usual civic remembrances that communities affix to their geography when they want to signal that something important happened here, in this specific soil, in this specific light. But the field itself does not remember. The earth that once drank the blood of soldiers from Arabia and Syria and the Berber hills of North Africa and the Rhine Valley and the forests of Aquitaine holds no memory of what it drank. It grows whatever it is asked to grow. It receives whatever falls on it. The indifference of landscape to the battles fought over it is one of the quietly devastating facts about human history. We care so much. We care so much about our boundaries, our identities, our civilizations, our definitions of who belongs and who does not, which God is real and which is false, which people deserve to persist, and which are the enemies of persistence. We go to extraordinary lengths. We cross deserts and mountain ranges and seas. We build armies and equip them and march them thousands of miles. We kill and are killed in defense of these distinctions. And the earth beneath our feet, which will outlast every civilization that has ever fought over it, does not care at all. This is not a counsel of despair. It is not the claim that nothing matters because everything is temporary. It is something closer to the opposite, the recognition that the things that have lasted, the genuinely durable contributions of every civilization that has ever existed, are not the battles and the conquests and the defended borders. They are the mathematics and the medicine and the philosophy and the poetry. They are the things that crossed the borders that were supposedly being defended. The scholars of Cordoba who preserved Aristotle and transmitted him back to a Europe that had lost him. The Frankish clerics who, in the centuries after Tours, learned Arabic so they could read the astronomical and medical texts that Arabic scholars had produced. The slow, complicated, intellectually fertile exchange between the Islamic and Christian worlds of medieval Europe, an exchange that the mythology of Tours, with its clean division between civilization and barbarism, tends to obscure. The Battle of Tours happened. A governor died. An army withdrew. A warlord who was not yet a legend consolidated his political position and laid the groundwork for a dynasty that would shape European history for centuries. On the other side of the ledger, a civilization continued to flourish in Al-Andalus for 700 years after this supposed defeat, producing knowledge and beauty and complexity that enriched the world. Both of these things are true. The battle mattered. The myth that grew around the battle has been, at times, used for purposes that the people who fought the battle would not have recognized and probably would not have endorsed. The story is more complicated than the story that gets told. We do not remember Tours because it was the most important battle ever fought. We remember it because we needed it to be. We needed the moment that held, the line that did not break, the morning that arrived and found, against all the fear of the night before, that the thing we were afraid of losing was still there. And perhaps that need, that hunger for the decisive moment, for the proof that our particular version of the human project was worth preserving, that the chaos has a shape, and the shape is in our favor. Perhaps that tells us more about being human than any army ever could. The crow lifts from the branch. The fields receive the autumn light. The plain of Poitiers is quiet. It has always been quiet. After